Settle in. Close your eyes if you wish, though I suspect you won't want to. Not for this. What I am about to tell you is not the sort of thing that benefits from distraction, from the half-presence of a mind that wanders. No. This requires something rarer than raw talent. It requires attention. Tonight we are going back, far back, further than Hogwarts, further than Merlin, further than the founding of the wizarding world as you presently understand it. We are going back to a time before the neat, lacquered wand in its tissue-lined box. A time before garish advertisements and sprightly shop bells and the insufferable cheerfulness of shopkeepers who speak as though magic were a hobby. We are going back to the cold stone altars of ancient Britain, to the fog-wrapped forests where the first wand-makers knelt in mud and moss and made deals with wandering wood, to the long, unrecorded centuries in which magic was not elegant, was not precise, was frequently catastrophic, and was, in its own terrible way, alive. The history of the wand is the history of magical civilization itself. Every war fought, every law passed, every dynasty built or broken behind it all, held in the hand of some witch or wizard who may never have known how remarkable the instrument between their fingers truly was. There was a wand, and that wand had a story. Every wand has always had a story. Yours, if you have one, has a story too. Let us begin at the beginning. Part 1. Before the craft had a name, the pre-Livender era. Imagine Britain in the year 500 BC, not the quaint pastoral vision of rolling green hills and thatched roofs. No, something older, wilder, more indifferent to human comfort. The forests are enormous. They consume the landscape the way a sea consumes a shore, swallowing light and sound, and the petty ambitions of the creatures who live within them. The sky is grey for months at a time, and the cold comes not gradually, but all at once, like a pronouncement. In these forests, among the ancient Britons who built their settlements in clearings and beside rivers, there were magic folk. There have always been magic folk. Magic is not a recent invention, not a late development of the human species. It is something far older, far stranger, and far less interested in being understood than most wizards would care to admit. These early magical practitioners had magic. They felt it in their blood, saw it flicker in moments of strong emotion, felt it rise in their throats when they sang the old words over the dying or the newborn. But magic without direction is a fire without a hearth. It warms nothing reliably. It burns everything it touches. And so the first wands came to exist not out of artistry, but out of necessity. They were not wands in any sense that Garrick Ollivander would have recognized. He, in fact, described them with characteristic bluntness as crude and shabby instruments. He was not wrong. They were lengths of wood, sometimes not even properly wood, but the thick, woody stems of larger plants, the hardened stalks of something that resembled a tree without technically being one. They were snapped from their branches, or pulled from the earth with little ceremony and less understanding. They were carried because carrying a piece of wood when you performed magic seemed to help, in the same way that having a wall behind you when you fall tends to result in a better outcome than not having one. The principle was intuited before it was understood. A focused object, Something held, something fixed, something channeling the witch or wizard's will through a physical point, allowed magic to cohere. Without it, magic was diffuse, dangerous, unreliable. With even the crudest of wands, a skilled practitioner could direct it, aim it, give it shape. But skilled is doing a great deal of work in that sentence. These early wands did not choose their wielders. They did not attune themselves. They did not develop allegiances or resist inappropriate use or perform better for one person than another. They were sticks, useful sticks, yes, sticks that responded to magical intention with something approaching cooperation, but sticks nonetheless. The results were, as you might imagine, wildly inconsistent. A spell that worked perfectly on a Monday might explode backward on a Wednesday for reasons that no one could explain, and everyone blamed on the phase of the moon. A wand that performed admirably for one which might prove actively hostile in the hands of her son, not because of any magical incompatibility, but simply because the wood had begun to rot slightly from the inside. There was no science here. There was barely even art. There was, at best, tradition passed down from elder to child in the form of rules that no one fully understood, rituals that sometimes worked and sometimes didn't, and a great deal of educated guessing dressed in the clothing of authority. The wizarding world of this era was a world in which magic was as likely to harm you as help you, not because the practitioners were careless or unskilled, but because the instrument between their fingers was fundamentally unequal to the task. A great sorcerer armed with a branch snapped from a hedgerow was still, in some sense, fighting with one hand behind their back, possessed of tremendous power and no reliable way to express it. The gap between a witch's magical ability and her wand's capacity to channel it was, in this era, often vast, and that gap had consequences that rippled through every aspect of magical life. Healing was less reliable. Defense was more dangerous. Even basic domestic magic, the spells that kept a home warm, that preserved food, that lit a room, required more effort and produced less consistent results than a modern wizard performing the same task would find thinkable. Magic was harder, not because the witches and wizards were lesser. They were not lesser, not in any meaningful sense. Many of them were individuals of formidable natural talent, but they were individuals of formidable natural talent, wielding instruments that were, frankly, not up to their ability. This is the world that needed changing, and the agents of that change arrived, as so many transformative forces do, from elsewhere, the first wand makers. When memory becomes method. Before we move to the Roman arrival, it is worth pausing to acknowledge something that tends to get lost in the broad historical sweep. There were, even in this crude era, individuals who were better at making wands than others. People who had accumulated, through trial and error and careful observation, a knowledge of wood that surpassed their contemporaries. People who noticed, for instance, that wands made from freshly cut wood behaved differently than wands made from wood that had been allowed to season. Who noticed that the density of the grain affected how the wand responded to certain spells. Who noticed that two pieces of ostensibly identical wood, taken from the same tree at the same time, could produce markedly different results. These early wand makers were not yet scientists. They had no framework for understanding what they were observing, no language for the properties they were intuiting, but they had something just as important. They were paying attention. They were keeping, if not written, records. Then the oral equivalent, the careful mental catalogue of what worked and what didn't, passed on to the next generation with the specificity that practical knowledge demands. Some of these practitioners, particularly in Britain's Celtic cultures, occupied a specific social role. They were not general-purpose witches or wizards dabbling in wandcraft as a side interest. They were specialists, and the most important of these specialists, the ones who shaped British wandcraft in the centuries before the Roman conquest, were the people we know as Druids. The word Druid has survived 2,000 years of cultural transmission and emerged, inevitably, somewhat distorted. Muggle history has made of them something between religious priests and romantic nature mystics, which captures aspects of the reality without capturing the whole of it. The Druids were, in the first instance, the learned class of ancient Celtic society, the keepers of knowledge in a largely pre-literate culture, the experts in law, in medicine, in astronomy, in the interpretation of natural phenomena, and in magic. In a society where writing was little used, the Druids carried everything in their minds, trained through decades of apprenticeship to hold vast quantities of information with perfect fidelity. And among the things they held in their minds, passed down through those decades of apprenticeship, was an increasingly sophisticated understanding of wood. The Druids, wandcraft, as sacred knowledge. The Druidic approach to wandcraft was rooted in a philosophy of taxonomy, specifically in a rather generous interpretation of what constituted a tree. The Druids held nature sacred in a way that modern wizarding culture, frankly, does not. Trees were not merely botanical specimens to them. They were entities, repositories of natural magic, alive in ways that transcended simple biology. They assigned meaning, personality, and magical properties to every species of wood they encountered. The oak was power and endurance. The ash was connection between worlds. The yew was death and rebirth. The elder was danger and wisdom in equal, unnerving measure. But here is where it becomes interesting, particularly for our purposes. The Druids had a definition of tree that was, shall we say, expansive. Any plant with a woody stem, any plant that lignified its structure, that grew persistent woody tissue, could, under their system of classification, be considered a tree. A vine, then, might grow technically upward from a grape variety and never reach beyond a man's knee. But if its stem was woody, if it had the internal structure of wood, the Druids called it a tree and considered its wood worthy of a wand. This was not merely definitional sloppiness. It was a deliberate philosophical choice with practical, magical implications. Including plants like vine, elder in its shrubby forms, blackthorn, holly, and other species that strict modern botanists might hesitate to call trees. The Druids dramatically expanded the palette of available wand materials. They explored combinations that more rigid, later traditions would never have considered. They discovered, through decades of practice and considerable trial and error, that vine wood was not inferior to oak. It was different. That blackthorn, often passed over by later wand-makers for its association with darkness, had properties of stubborn resilience that made it extraordinary for certain practitioners. That elder wood was a matter requiring its own extended conversation, which we will certainly have before this night is over. The Druidic wand-making calendar was complex, deliberate, and tied to cycles that the modern world would find either mystical or tedious, depending on your temperament. There were right seasons for cutting wood, right phases of the moon, right relationships between the harvester and the harvested. These were not arbitrary superstitions dressed in ceremonies. The Druids had noticed correctly, as modern wand-makers have confirmed through more systematic study, that wood harvested at certain times of year has different magical properties than wood from the same tree harvested at others. Spring wood is different from autumn wood. Wood cut during a full moon has different density and moisture content than wood cut during a new moon, and these differences, subtle as they may appear to someone who thinks of a tree as merely a tree, translate into wands that behave differently, to where, to wisan, to prist be, with, as is, or where the, with, above, persa, to, with, to, let, They were empiricists, working without the language of empiricism. They were scientists without the scientific method, but the observations they accumulated, and the methods they developed in response to those observations, represent the foundation on which everything that came after was built. The Druids were not, to be clear, producing wands in any modern sense. They were not taking appointments at a counter and measuring arm lengths with cloth tape. Their wandcraft was ritualistic, seasonal, deeply tied to specific astronomical events and the natural cycles of the forest. A wand was made when it was made, when the wood was right, when the practitioner was ready, when the signs aligned in whatever particular configuration the wand-maker's tradition held significant. There were no ready-made wands waiting on shelves. And as for cores, the concept of a wand core, as we understand it today, did not exist. The wood was the wand, full stop. Sometimes other materials were incorporated, bone-carved sigils, fiber wrapped around the grip for comfort and better handling, but these were decorative or structural, not magical. The Druids did not yet understand that the interior of a wand might be as important as, or more important than, the exterior. That revelation was still centuries away. What they did understand, better perhaps than any tradition that came after them, was wood. They knew the subtle differences between two pieces of the same species cut from different parts of the forest. They knew that wood taken from a tree that had been struck by lightning was not the same as wood from its untouched neighbor. They knew that age mattered, that season of harvest mattered, that the relationship between the wand-maker and the living tree was part of what made the final product more than just a carved piece of timber. In this, at least, they were not so different from the wand-makers who came after. The tools changed, the philosophy expanded, but the reverence for wood that particular, attentive understanding that a one's character begins not at the workbench, but in the living forest that is Druidic. We carry it still, in every wand-maker's tradition that has followed, whether or not those wand-makers know where it came from. Part 2. The Roman arrival and the first stall. How the Ollivanders came to Britain. In the year 43 AD, the Roman Emperor Claudius sent his legions across the narrow channel between the continent and the island of Britain, and with them came everything that Rome carried: its architecture, its language, its law, its religion, its ambitions, and hidden within that vast cultural migration, something the history books do not record: its wizards. The Roman magical tradition was different from the British one, where the Druidic approach was organic, forest-born, deeply tied to the physical world of trees and seasons. The Roman tradition was more formalized, more theoretical. Rome had a bureaucracy for everything, including, it appears, magic. There were practitioners in Rome who wrote down what they knew, who debated technique, who disagreed vigorously about methodology, in the way that educated people always disagree vigorously about methodology, which is to say, often, loudly, and with great personal investment in being proved correct. Rome had access, through its vast network of trade and empire, to magical materials and magical knowledge from across the known world. Egyptian magical traditions had flowed into Rome. Greek philosophy, which had its own deep engagement with the magical properties of the natural world, had shaped Roman thinking. Eastern mysteries, brought back by soldiers and merchants from campaigns and travels in Persia and beyond, had added yet further layers. Roman wizardry, by the 1st century AD, was a sophisticated synthesis of traditions that the isolated British magical community had never encountered. Among the magical families who came to Britain in the wake of the Roman conquest, not soldiers, you understand, not the brutal instrument of imperial ambition, but the merchants, the scholars, the curious, the ambitious. There was a family whose name has survived the centuries in the way that only truly significant names do, by earning their survival. The name itself is a clue that, like most truly interesting clues, requires knowing what to look for in order to see it. Ollivander, pass it carefully. From the ancient roots, oliva, the olive tree, ander, he who owns, he who has mastery of, he who owns the olive wand, he who is master of the olive. This is not incidental. It is not coincidental. The olive tree is Mediterranean. It does not grow in Britain. It has never grown in Britain to any significant degree. Certainly not in any way that a wand-maker might have considered harvesting from British soil. The Ollivander family brought their olive wands with them from the sunlit slopes of southern Europe, where the olive tree had been sacred to Greek and Roman practitioners for centuries, regarded as a wood of peace, of wisdom, of the sustained, patient endurance for which it was already famous among the Muggles, who pressed its fruit for oil. The olive has a particular quality that made it interesting to Mediterranean wand-makers. It is extraordinarily a piece of olive wood of usable size, for a wand represents decades, sometimes centuries, of growth. This slow accumulation gives the wood a density and a magical stability that faster-growing species cannot match. Olive wood wands from the Mediterranean tradition were known for their reliability, their precision, their tendency to form deep, lasting bonds with their owners. They were, in the language of the craft, patient instruments, not flashy, not dramatic, but extraordinarily consistent. When the first Ollivander set up their stall in what would eventually, many centuries later, become Diagon Alley, in whatever the equivalent was in Roman-occupied Britain, some bustling, magical marketplace hidden just adjacent to the Roman trading posts that were springing up across the south of the island, they brought with them not merely foreign wood, but a foreign concept, the idea of the wand as a crafted, considered, systematically made instrument. This is revolutionary, and it is easy to underestimate just how revolutionary it was, because we exist on the far side of it, and cannot easily imagine what came before. Before the Ollivanders brought their approach to Britain, a witch or wizard seeking a wand either made their own, using whatever knowledge they had inherited from their family or community, with all the inconsistency that implies, or sought out a druidic specialist whose availability was seasonal, whose methods were opaque, and whose product, however skillfully made, was not the result of a systematic understanding of how wands actually worked. The Ollivanders offered something different. They offered expertise, not just intuition or tradition or reverence, but a body of knowledge that had been accumulated over generations and refined through deliberate practice. They had opinions about wood, specific, argued, technical opinions. They had theories about construction. They had methods that they understood well enough to explain, even if they did not always explain them. They had, in short, a craft, not a ritual. A craft, and a craft can be improved upon. A ritual can be honored, can be maintained, can be expanded in narrow ways, but its sacred nature makes it resistant to the kind of systematic revision that genuine progress requires. You cannot easily say to a druid that their method of choosing the harvest moon for woodcutting is unnecessary, that the wood's quality is determined by other factors that can be controlled without reference to the lunar calendar. The sacred nature of the practice insulates it from critique. A craft is different. A craft says, we do this because it produces the best results. And if something else produces better results, we will do that instead. A craft is self-correcting in a way that ritual cannot be. The Ollivanders brought this craftsman's mind to British wand-making, and the British magical community was changed by it. Not immediately. Change of this kind is never immediate. The Druidic traditions persisted for centuries alongside the Ollivander approach, and the Ollivanders themselves learned from the Druids, because they were too intelligent not to learn from the Druids. The knowledge of British wood species that the Druids had accumulated over generations was invaluable, and the Ollivanders absorbed it, integrated it, and built upon it. But the philosophical transformation was occurring, slowly, over generations. The idea that wandcraft was a science, not merely an art, not merely a sacred practice, but something that could be understood, studied, improved, was taking root. The family thrived. Of course they thrived. They were filling a need that the British magical community had not fully articulated but felt acutely. They expanded their knowledge of British woods, incorporating the species they found in this northern forest into their existing framework. They added oak and ash and yew and holly and hawthorn and the dozens of other species that Druidic tradition had already elevated, studying them with fresh eyes and different methods, confirming some of what the Druids believed, and quietly revising other parts of it. And for centuries, their craft evolved. The family grew. Generations succeeded each other. The original olive wood specialization broadened to encompass the full range of British and European woods. The shop, or the stall that became the shop, accumulated a reputation that became, over time, the single most reliable indicator of quality in the British wand-making world. When you wanted a wand that would serve you properly, you went to Ollivander. This was not always convenient. This was not always affordable. But it was, if you could manage it, what you did. Part 3. The problem of cores. What customers used to bring through the door. For much of wand-making history, for most of the long centuries between the first Ollivander stall and the early modern period, the practice of wand-making had a peculiar arrangement that modern witches and wizards would find deeply strange. Customers brought their own cores. Let that settle in for a moment. Imagine walking into a tailor and being told that you must supply your own thread, that the tailor will cut and shape and sew with exceptional skill. But the fundamental connective material, the element that in many ways determines the final garments. Character is your responsibility to source. The tailor has wood. The wood is the tailor's domain, and it is expertly chosen, carefully dried, precisely worked. But the core, that is your contribution. This arrangement tells us something important for a very long time. The nature of wand cores was not fully understood. Wand makers knew that something inside the wand, some material that carried its own magical charge, some substance that brought a quality to the wand that the wood alone could not, was beneficial. But what that something should be, and why, was not yet a matter of scientific understanding. It was a matter of tradition, superstition, and the personal magical associations that individual practitioners held. The concept of the wand core itself represents a significant intellectual leap from the Druidic tradition of coreless wood wands. Someone, at some point in the history of wandcraft, the exact identity lost to the absence of reliable records from the relevant period, had the insight that the interior of the wand might matter as much as the exterior, that a small piece of something else placed at the wand's heart could change the nature of the magic it produced in ways that transcended what the wood alone provided. This insight, once had, could not be unhad. Once wand-makers began experimenting with cores, the improvement in results was sufficient that the practice spread rapidly. But the spread of the practice did not come with a corresponding spread of understanding about which cores worked and why. The result was, to put it mildly, a free market of magical materials that produced results ranging from the genuinely excellent to the genuinely alarming. Kelpie hair was particularly popular among Scottish practitioners, despite, or perhaps because of, the Kelpie's reputation as a malevolent waterhorse that drowned its victims. The logic appeared to be that a predatory, powerful, magical creature's hair would produce a powerful wand. The logic was not entirely wrong, but it was incomplete. Kelpie hair is deeply unstable. It retains something of the creature's nature, its volatility, its tendency toward sudden, violent action. Wands made with Kelpie cores had a documented tendency toward unpredictable behavior, producing surprising results, not because the magic was particularly powerful, but because the core occasionally seemed to decide, entirely on its own, that a different sort of spell was preferable to the one requested. This is not a trivial problem. A wand that occasionally substitutes its own judgment for the wielder's is not a useful tool. It is a liability. In the middle of a duel, a wand that decides that a blasting curse is more appropriate than the shield charm you requested is not helping you. In the middle of a healing procedure, a wand that amplifies at random intervals is not a medical instrument. It is a hazard. The instability of Kelpie hair as a core material was not theoretical. It had consequences that ended careers, and occasionally lives. Troll whiskers were in vogue for a period, though the reasoning behind this particular enthusiasm is difficult to reconstruct with confidence. Trolls are not notably magical creatures. They are notable mainly for their size, their smell, and their commitment to violence as a solution to most problems. Whiskers from a troll appear to contribute nothing of value to a wand core, producing instruments that were at best mediocre and at worst actively counterproductive. The fashion for troll whisker cores faded, as fashions based on flawed premises tend to do. Once enough wands made with them had failed spectacularly enough to make the pattern unmistakable. Velar hair is a more interesting case, and one that touches on questions that are not merely practical but philosophical. Velar are remarkable creatures, part human in appearance, entirely inhuman in nature, possessed of a magical radiance that affects those around them in ways both beautiful and dangerous. Their hair carries a genuine magical charge, and wands made with it as a core are functional, sometimes impressively so. But Velar hair has a quality that many wand-makers noted with concern. It is capricious. It is inclined toward dramatic effects and grand gestures. It favors passion over precision. A wizard of intense emotional nature might find that a Velar hair wand suits them perfectly. It amplifies feeling into magic in a way that such a person might find exhilarating. A witch who requires careful, measured, reproducible magic, the kind of thing that actually keeps a potions laboratory from catching fire, would find a Velar hair wand exhausting at worst. There is something revealing in this limitation. Magic, at its core, is an expression of intent, of a person's will, their focus, their desire shaped into action. A wand core that amplifies emotion over intention is not amplifying magic exactly. It is amplifying one element of the wizard's psychology, the passionate, the dramatic, the instinctive, at the expense of the other elements. It creates a wand that is good at a specific kind of magic for a specific kind of person, and inadequate for everything else. Garrick Ollivander, who arrived at his revolutionary conclusions through decades of observation, experimentation, and the kind of obsessive record-keeping that was either admirable or terrifying, depending on your perspective, found Velar hair so unreliable that he refused to use it at all. This was a notable stance to take against a material with genuine magical properties, and it tells us something important about what he was looking for. He was not looking for cores with occasional brilliance. He was not looking for cores that might be extraordinary under the right circumstances. He was looking for cores that were reliable, that were consistent, that could be counted upon to behave predictably across a wide range of users, intentions, and magical contexts. That was the standard, and by that standard, the vast majority of the materials that customers had been dragging through the door for centuries failed. Part 4. The Supreme Core Revolution. Garrick Ollivander changes everything. In the records that exist from the pre-modern wizarding world, fragmentary, incomplete, filtered through decades and centuries of transcription errors and deliberate omissions, Garrick Ollivander appears sometime in the early modern period as a figure of unusual intensity. He was, by all accounts, a wand-maker's wand-maker, the kind of practitioner who did not merely continue a family trade, but consumed it, absorbed it completely, and then began the slow, methodical work of improving it. He was also, clearly, something of a difficult personality. His contemporaries describe him in terms that range from meticulous beyond all reasonable expectation to rather alarming in his single-mindedness. He kept records of every wand he made with a thoroughness that strikes me, personally, as the only sensible approach to knowledge. Every detail of wood type and grain, every measurement, every material used as core, every observation about the wand's behavior during and after making, and, crucially, every subsequent report about that wand's performance in actual use. These follow-up records were, in themselves, a departure from wand-making tradition. Most wand-makers of his era made a wand and sold it, and that was the end of their professional interest in it. What happened to the wand afterward was the owner's business, not the craftsman's. Ollivander thought differently. He considered the performance of a wand in actual use to be data, and he collected that data with the determination of a man who had decided that he would not be satisfied with guessing where knowledge was available. Over years that became decades, the picture that emerged from those records was damning. The substandard cores, the troll whiskers, the kelpie hair, the vela hair, the various other materials that witches and wizards had been contributing to their own wands, did not merely underperform. They actively interfered with the relationship between wand and wizard. They introduced inconsistency. They complicated allegiance. They made the wand a less effective tool for the very purpose it was meant to serve. And so Garrick Ollivander did what any scientist does when the data demands it. He changed the practice. He made a decision that, at the time, must have seemed both principled and commercially risky. He stopped accepting customer-supplied cores. He would source the cores himself. He would accept only materials that his own research had identified as reliably superior. And the materials he identified as superior not in the sense of being impressive or exotic or associated with powerful creatures, but superior in the specific, demanding sense of producing reliable, consistent, excellent results across the widest possible range of owners, were three. The three materials he identified as Supreme Core were not, strictly speaking, his invention. All three had been used as wand core before, had been among the materials that clients occasionally brought in, with varying degrees of success. But no one before. Ollivander had systematically demonstrated why these three in particular produced consistently superior results. nor articulated how the properties of each core translated into specific wand characteristics: unicorn hair, dragon heartstring, phoenix feather. These three, not four, not six, not a sliding scale of quality. 3. And the precision of that determination should tell you something about the depth of work that went into it. This was not a commercial shortcut, not a convenient simplification of a complex field. This was the conclusion of rigorous study, the number that the evidence produced when the evidence was given sufficient respect to speak for itself. Unicorn hair, the faithful core. The unicorn is, in the purely magical taxonomy of creatures, something close to a symbol made flesh. It is the embodiment of purity, not in any sentimental or moralistic sense, but in a magical one. The unicorn's magic is stable. It is consistent. It does not fluctuate with mood or circumstance, or the phase of the celestial bodies. It simply is, with a constancy that is almost geometrically perfect. This stability is not passivity. The unicorn is not a creature of weakness or inaction. Anyone who has encountered one in its natural state knows that the purity ascribed to it comes with an authority and a presence that makes most other magical creatures seem comparatively insubstantial. But the unicorn's power is anchored. It does not surge or ebb. It is what it is, completely, at all times. Wands with unicorn hair cores inherit this quality. They are the most faithful of the three supreme types, faithful to their first owner, faithful to the magic used through them, faithful to consistent performance across a wide range of spells and conditions. A unicorn hair wand will almost never produce accidental magic of the wild, uncontrolled variety. It will not suddenly decide that a different spell is preferable to the one requested. It will not amplify beyond what the wizard intended. This faithfulness manifests most clearly in the wand's relationship with its first owner. A unicorn hair wand bonds more deeply to the first person who masters it than either of the other two supreme core types. It does not shift allegiance easily, even under conditions that would prompt a dragon heartstring wand to transfer its loyalty without significant reluctance. It remembers, it prefers, it holds. For most witches and wizards, across most applications of magic, this is exactly what you want. The overwhelming majority of magic is not a dramatic duel or a heroic act of sacrifice. It is the daily, unremarkable work of making life function. Cooking, healing, traveling, building, communicating, maintaining. For this kind of work, unicorn hair is not merely adequate, it is ideal. The limitation, and every core has its limitation, which Ollivander was scrupulous about documenting alongside the advantages, is that unicorn hair wands are the least prone to what he called great leaps. They do not naturally excel at magic that requires reaching beyond normal parameters, the extraordinary curse that should have been beyond a young witch's ability. The healing charm performed under extreme duress that works at twice its usual potency. The faithfulness that makes unicorn hair wands reliable also makes them, in some ways, bounded. They reflect the wizard faithfully. They do not often amplify beyond what the wizard is. This is not a flaw so much as a consequence of the core's fundamental nature. A mirror that shows you exactly as you are is not lying when it fails to show you as you might be. But the unicorn hair wand serves who you are with exceptional dedication. Becoming something more is, in this case, the wizard's responsibility rather than the wand's. There is also a quality that attaches to these wands that Ollivander noted with care. A unicorn hair wand that has been forced to perform dark magic does not simply return to itself when the dark magic ceases. Something in it, some quality tied to the source material's fundamental nature, is diminished, not destroyed necessarily, but changed. The faithfulness persists, but something of its quality is different. It mourns, if wood and hair can be said to mourn. This is not anthropomorphism, or if it is anthropomorphism that accurately predicts the wand's behavior, which is the only kind that matters in practical wand lore. A wand that has been used for sustained dark magic performs less well than one that has not. This is measurable. It is consistent, and the most useful explanation of the data, however uncomfortable its implications, is that the wand has been in some sense harmed by the experience. Dragon heartstring, the ambitious core. The dragon is many things, but above all else it is force. It is scale and fire, and the absolute conviction that it is the most dangerous thing in any room it enters, which, to be fair, it usually is. There is something in the dragon's nature that does not permit uncertainty. It does not hesitate, does not doubt, does not modulate its power to accommodate the comfort of those around it. It is, in the most complete sense of the word, committed to its territory, to its prey, to its fire, to itself. A dragon heartstring core carries this nature into the wand. These wands are the most powerful of the three supreme types, and they learn fastest. Give a dragon heartstring wand to a young witch or wizard of ability, and it will pick up new spells with an alacrity that can, occasionally, be startling. It does not wait patiently to be taught. It leans in. It is ambitious on behalf of its owner in a way that can be enormously useful and, in the wrong circumstances, slightly unnerving. Dragon heartstring wands also produce the widest range of magic. They are generalists in the sense that they perform excellently across virtually every school of spellcraft. They are particularly adept at more powerful offensive magic, which is perhaps unsurprising given the nature of their source. But they do not limit themselves to violence. A dragon heartstring wand in the hands of a healer can be extraordinarily effective, because the same force that makes it excel in combat also makes it capable of the kind of dramatic intervention that heals a wound that should have been fatal. The limitation, as Ollivander documented it with characteristic precision, is a tendency toward the dramatic. Dragon heartstring wands have a slight, well-documented propensity for what might be described as showing off. They produce, with some regularity, the most ostentatious possible version of any given spell. Ask a dragon heartstring wand for a simple lumos, and you may get a lumos that lights not just your immediate path, but the entire corridor and 3 adjacent rooms. This is rarely catastrophic. It is sometimes embarrassing. It occasionally, depending on the circumstances, sets things on fire. They are also, of the 3 supreme cores, most susceptible to changing allegiance. Not unreliably, not in the chaotic way of substandard cores, but more readily than unicorn hair or phoenix feather. A dragon heartstring wand may shift its primary allegiance to a new owner who has defeated the original through fair, magical contest. There is something in the dragon's nature, perhaps, that respects power demonstrated rather than power inherited. It does not feel particularly obligated to sentiment. It does not hold on to what has been superseded by what is. If you are stronger, it will acknowledge this and adjust its loyalty accordingly. This is not fickleness. It is a different relationship to loyalty than the one the unicorn core provides. Not worse, not better, simply different. A dragon heartstring wand will serve you completely, right up until the moment someone demonstrates that they deserve it more, at which point it will serve them instead with equal completeness. Phoenix feather, the rarest core. The phoenix is the most magical of the three source creatures. The unicorn is pure. The dragon is powerful. But the phoenix is transcendent. It dies and it lives again, not as a metaphor, not as a poetic description of some subtle transformation, but literally, in a burst of flame from which it rises renewed, carrying nothing forward from its previous life except itself. It sings in a way that makes the hearing of it feel like a kind of medicine that you did not know you needed. It weeps tears that heal wounds that have no other remedy. It carries the capacity for transformation, not merely change, but the specific kind of change that involves passing through destruction to arrive at something new. Phoenix feather wands are rare. This is not merely a matter of supply. Phoenixes are uncommon creatures, yes, but that is not the full explanation. Phoenix feather wands are rare because they are selective. They choose their owners with a specificity that neither unicorn hair nor dragon heartstring approaches. A phoenix feather wand presented to 50 prospective owners might find, among those 50, that one suits it, that one will suit it extraordinarily well, but the others will not do at all. This selectivity was why Ollivander found Phoenix feather wands the most difficult and interesting of the three types to make and sell. He could not predict, in the way that he could with the other two, how many customers would leave his shop with a phoenix feather wand versus another type. The wands themselves, in some sense that defied precise articulation, knew what they wanted, and they were willing to wait. The ones that do choose their owners show the greatest range of any of the three core types, not in the sense of being good at everything, as Dragon Heartstring is, but in the sense of showing the most individual variation, from wand to wand, and wizard to phoenix feather wands, of the same dimensions and wood type, will behave differently in the hands of different owners. They are, of the three supreme cores, the most truly personalized, the most prone to what Ollivander called acting of their own accord, the most likely to do something unexpected in a moment of genuine extremity, something the witch or wizard did not consciously request, but which, in retrospect, was exactly the right thing to do. They are also, Ollivander noted this carefully, and it is worth noting now, capable of the widest range in terms of light and dark magic. This is not a flaw. It is a quality of the source. The phoenix encompasses death and rebirth, destruction and healing, ending and beginning. Its feather wands will perform whatever magic the owner's soul is capable of requesting. They do not filter. They do not prefer one kind of magic over another in the way that a unicorn hair wand, through its fundamental nature, tends to resist dark magic. They serve as a mirror, in some sense, more completely than the other types. In the right hands, a phoenix feather wand is capable of magic that transcends the ordinary in a way that leaves observers speechless. In the wrong hands, it is capable of acts of darkness that the wand itself seems to contain some distant, unheeded memory of having once pointed in a different direction. Part 5. The Science of Wood and Core. When pairing becomes an art, understanding the three supreme cores is necessary but not sufficient. The core is one half of a conversation. The wood is the other. And the relationship between them, the way a specific wood's character shapes and is shaped by a specific core's nature, is where wand-making ceases to be a science and begins to be something that resists full systematization. Every wood species carries what Ollivander called its innate character, a complex of magical properties, temperamental inclinations, and affinities that determine how it performs as a wand material. This character is not arbitrary. It derives from the tree's own nature, its biology, its place in magical taxonomy, its history of use, and something that resists material explanation, the particular manner in which different species have accumulated magical resonance over millennia of proximity to magical creatures, magical practitioners, and magical events. Wood is a living archive. A tree that grows in a forest where magic has been practiced for centuries is not the same as a tree of identical species grown in a field where magic has never been performed. The wood absorbs something, not in any mystical sense that requires special pleading, in the same way that any organic material is shaped by its environment. Wood is shaped by the magical environment in which it grows. The resonance is real. It is measurable, if you have the instruments and the knowledge to measure it. Yew is perhaps the most immediately illustrative example. The yew tree is ancient, one of the longest-lived trees in Britain, with specimens that predate recorded human history, trees that were already old when the Druids were young. It grows in churchyards because churches were built where sacred groves had stood, and the yew had been considered sacred for longer than Christianity has existed. It is poisonous, not incidentally, not as a side effect, but fundamentally, throughout its structure, bark, leaf, seed, the bright red areole that looks deceptively edible. Its very beauty is part of its danger. Binds choose owners whose lives are defined by some form of extreme contrast. Great capacity for good and great capacity for its opposite held in tension. They have a particular and well-documented affinity for magic that involves the boundary between life and death. They excel at the killing curse. Yes, there is no point in being coy about this. It is a fact, and the Dark Lord himself carried a yew wand, a piece of information that is not incidental, but they also excel at healing magic that reverses what should have been fatal, at protections against death, at magic that preserves life against odds that would suggest otherwise. The yew does not favor death over life. It favors the understanding that these are not opposites, but partners, and that any wizard who wishes to work at that boundary must understand both sides with equal clarity. Cyprus carries associations of the heroic, the noble sacrifice, the death accepted rather than fled from. Cyprus wands tend to choose witches and wizards who are brave not in the theatrical sense of the dueling champion, but in the quieter, more demanding sense of someone who has looked at what may be asked of them and has decided, in full awareness, that they will not run. There is something in Cyprus that is deeply patient and deeply serious. Wands of cypress wood are rarely flashy. They are rarely the instrument of great theatrical magical displays. They are the wands of people who, at the critical moment, do what needs doing. Holly, bright, red-berried, a traditional emblem of protection against evil, which is not a Muggle's superstition, but a derived memory of an actual magical property, creates wands ideally suited to counteracting dark magic and protecting the innocent. A holly wand often selects someone with an ongoing conflict in their life, a personal struggle or opposition that defines much of their magical practice. It provides particular strength for protective spells and charms, and tends to channel its greatest force precisely when the wizard's intent is genuinely defensive, rather than aggressive. The holly wand, in other words, rewards those who protect rather than those who strike, and punishes the misuse of that quality with a thoroughness that makes such misuse inadvisable. Vine, the druidic tree, the growing, climbing, tenacious plant that produces fruit and is itself a kind of generous, reaching magic, makes wands of surprising power for owners who are seekers. Not in the athletic sense, though that is one manifestation, but in the deeper sense. People who seek meaning, who pursue purpose, who are not content to simply be, but must continually reach toward understanding. Vine wands are unusual, because they seem to form a connection with their owner's broader life trajectory. They perform best when the magic they're channeling is in alignment with something the wizard genuinely cares about. Use a vine wand for magic you find meaningless or morally empty, and it will notice. It will not necessarily refuse. These are tools, not judges, but the quality will suffer in a way that tells you something worth knowing about yourself. The pairing of these woods with the supreme core produces what Ollivander called a compound character. Not merely the sum of wood and core properties, but a new entity whose qualities emerge from the interaction between them. A phoenix feather core in a holly wand does not simply add phoenix feather qualities to holly qualities. The selectiveness of the phoenix feather and the protective nature of holly interact to create a wand that is extraordinarily particular about its owner, requiring someone who is genuinely, at their core, driven by protection of others, and then serving that owner with a kind of unstinting dedication that is, among wands, exceptional. A dragon heartstring core in a vine wand creates something almost paradoxical. The vine's need for meaningful purpose, combined with the dragon's raw ambition. This tends to produce a wand that is quite literally difficult to use for anything the wizard does not actually care about. It performs brilliantly when the magic serves something the owner values, and rather poorly otherwise. For a determined, values-driven witch or wizard, this is wonderful. For someone who needs to perform a variety of spells, regardless of their personal investment in each one, it is inconvenient. Character, as I have occasionally found necessary to inform students in my own classroom, has consequences. Wilder, I have been keeping you waiting for this one, and I will not delay any further. Elder wands occupy an unusual position in wand lore. The wood is considered by many traditions to be dangerous. The elder tree is the last tree in the Ogham alphabet, the tree associated with endings, with the final boundary between life and what lies beyond. It is a wood that carries an inherent instability, an undertow of the unexpected. Elder wands are not recommended for those who are not fully prepared for the full consequences of using them. They demand respect. They demand, in some sense, a kind of reckoning with what they are. And then, of course, there is the elder wand, which is elder wood, in the way that a tidal wave is water, technically accurate, fundamentally inadequate as a description. Part 6. The Laws of Wand Allegiance. Why your wand is yours. A wand in common wizarding use is not simply a tool. It is not analogous to a knife or a measuring cup or any other instrument that simply waits neutrally to be picked up and used. From the moment of its first choosing, from the moment a wand selects its owner or is selected by them, to processes that are not always as distinct as they might appear. Something begins. Something develops. The relationship between wand and wizard is, to use a word that is both accurate and faintly uncomfortable in its implications, alive. Wands learn. This is not metaphorical. A wand used regularly by a particular witch or wizard begins to adapt to them, to understand the patterns of their magic, to smooth the execution of spells they use frequently, to develop a kind of muscle memory that mirrors the wizard's own. A wand that has been with its owner for many years is a different instrument than it was when new, not physically different, but magically different, tuned and attuned in ways that make it increasingly an extension of the wizard, rather than a separate object. This is why wand-making tradition has always held that using another person's wand is inadvisable when any alternative exists. The adaptation is specific and bidirectional. The wand adapts to you, but you also, subtly, adapt to it. Your magic develops partly in response to the wand's particular character. Your techniques, your instincts, your magical habits are all shaped in small but cumulatively significant ways by the instrument you are using. A witch who has spent 10 years with a unicorn hair wand of elder wood may find a dragon heartstring wand of oak actively disorienting, not because she cannot produce magic through it, but because everything she reaches for reflexively goes slightly wrong. The way a person who has spent years writing with their right hand will find the left hand correct, but strange. This disorientation is one reason why the theft of another witch or wizard's wand, while uncommon, is considered in wizarding lore to be not merely a property crime, but something closer to an assault. You are not simply taking an object. You are taking something that has become, through years of use, genuinely part of who that person is magically. The effects of being deprived of your wand are worse than the effects of being deprived of a mere tool, and the effects of having your wand used against you by someone it has not chosen can be particularly disorienting. because there is some residual sense in the magic that flows back through a battle of the instrument that channeled it. Allegiance, however, is a more specific thing than familiarity. Allegiance is the deeper bond, the one's primary commitment to one owner over all others. And allegiance can change. The most common mechanism of change is conquest. If a wizard defeats another in magical combat and takes the defeated wizard's wand, the wand may not automatically, but with significant likelihood, transfer its primary allegiance to the conqueror. This is winning a wand in the most fundamental sense. It is not the same as stealing. Stealing a wand does not necessarily transfer allegiance. A stolen wand used by a wizard who did not genuinely overcome its owner will often underperform, producing weaker magic than it would in its proper owner's hands, as though it is withholding something. The wand knows the difference between defeat and theft. Do not mistake this for a moral judgment. It is simply an accurate assessment of what has occurred. The distinction matters because it is tied to something that wand lore considers important: the relationship between power demonstrated and power held. A wand recognizes, at some level we do not fully understand, the difference between power that was earned and power that was merely taken. Its allegiance, when it shifts toward the earned. It is a kind of factual assessment. This wizard has demonstrated, in direct contest, greater magical force or skill than the previous owner. This wizard has proven themselves, but this logic, so sensible in its application to ordinary wands, becomes something else entirely when applied to the most extraordinary wand in existence. Part 7. The Elder Wand, where normal rules break entirely. Every system has its anomaly. Every rule has its exception. In the science of wand lore, the Elder Wand is both, and it is both to such a degree that it functions less as an exception to the rules, and more as a demonstration that the rules, however accurate they are for the general case, were not derived from the full range of possible cases. The Elder Wand is not merely a powerful wand of the Elder Wood species. It is a separate category entirely, a singular object of such unique magical history and construction that it behaves according to principles that do not straightforwardly apply to other wands. Understanding the Elder Wand requires, first, setting aside almost everything you know about wand allegiance as it normally operates. Not because what you know is wrong, but because it was derived from observations of normal wands, and the Elder Wand is not a normal wand. Ordinary wands develop loyalty. This is the key word: loyalty. A wand that has been with its owner for years has adapted to them, come to prefer them, committed to them in a way that includes something like affection, if we can use such a word for an inanimate object, or, at minimum, preference. The allegiance of an ordinary wand, even when it shifts, involves something relational. There is history, there is memory, there is the accumulated residue of thousands of shared magical moments. The Elder Wand is, as Garrick Ollivander himself described it, completely unsentimental. These words are carefully chosen, and they mean exactly what they say. The Elder Wand does not form attachments. It does not develop loyalty in the warm, bilateral sense. It does not remember your first spell or your 1000th. It does not care that you have carried it for decades, that you have fought with it, healed with it, built your life around it. What it respects is power, only power, specifically the demonstration of power through conquest. Defeat the previous owner, genuinely, through a direct confrontation in which you prevailed, and the Elder Wand is yours, fully, immediately, completely. Its previous commitment evaporates without remainder. There is no ghost of old allegiance, no lingering preference for the former owner. You have won, and the wand accepts this with the cold, absolute logic of a wand that has spent centuries doing precisely this, passing from hand to hand through the long, violent history of every witch and wizard who discovered its existence and decided that possessing it would solve their problems. The Elder Wand's history is, consequently, an almost unbroken line of murder, not because it is evil in any sentient sense, not because it desires or encourages violence, but because the way to win it has generally been through killing, and because those who sought it were, as a self-selecting population, the sort of people who had no objection to that method. It is a record of human ambition, and the lengths to which human ambition will go when it believes it has found something worth the price. Egbert, the egregious, defeated Emmerich, the evil godlet, who wrote the infamous Magic Most Evil, owned it, and his son Hereward won it from him by imprisoning him in his own cellar until he died. Loxias, known as Barnabas the Balmy, claimed it, and multiple wizards each claimed to have killed Loxias to take it from him, so his murderer cannot be confirmed. Each transfer, violence, each new owner, a person who had been willing to kill to obtain it. The critical wrinkle, the anomaly that eventually brought its entire history toward an unexpected resolution, is that the Elder Wand does not require killing. It requires conquest. Killing the previous owner is the most direct form of conquest, the form least susceptible to ambiguity, but disarming them also constitutes conquest, rendering them helpless, defeating them through skill rather than fatal force. The Elder Wand accepts this just as fully. The wand does not know or care about the moral distinction between death and defeat. It registers, this person won. This person is now its master. This is information that in the final chapter of its history mattered enormously, though the person who accidentally became the master of the Elder Wand by disarming its owner did not know, for some time, that this had occurred. And the person who thought he had mastered it through killing did not know that he had not, that the chain of ownership had already passed through a hand he had not accounted for, through an act of disarmament in a darkened manor house, through the particular logic of a wand that cares only for conquest, and therefore cannot distinguish between conquests its owner expected, and conquests they did not. Appease the Elder Wand's nature as the supreme example of brute power, allegiance, makes it both the most obviously desirable and the most genuinely dangerous wand in existence. Not because it will harm its owner. It is, in all other respects, a superlative instrument, but because owning it places you in a tradition of violence. Every enemy who knows you have it has an incentive to acquire it through precisely the method by which you yourself acquired it. The Elder Wand is, in the most literal sense, a liability masquerading as an asset. It is the most powerful wand in existence. It is also, as Dumbledore ultimately concluded, a wand that is better not to have. Not because power is bad, but because certain kinds of power carry costs that compound over time in ways that no one, when they first grasp the prize, fully calculates. The Elder Wand's history is, among other things, a lesson in the mathematics of that kind of power. Every owner got what they came for. Very few of them were in a position to appreciate it for long. Part 8. Priori Incontemp. When wands possess memories of their own, there are phenomena in wand lore that the most experienced practitioners understand in only the most general terms, not from lack of trying, not from insufficient study, but because magic at its edges defies the kind of systematic understanding that makes most witches and wizards comfortable. Priori Incontemp, the reverse spell effect, is among these. It occurs, as far as wand lore can determine, when two wands that share the same core are forced into direct, sustained magical conflict, not merely to wands used by people who are dueling, that is common and unremarkable, but to wands whose cores originate from the same source, the same individual creature, the same specific instance of what created them. Brother wands, in the language of the craft. The key phrase here is sustained conflict. A brief collision of spells is common in any duel. The spells meet, one overcomes the other, or both are deflected, and the duel continues. This is not priori incontemp. What triggers the phenomenon is when neither wand yields, when both wizards maintain the magical connection between them, when the beams lock and neither breaks away, when the tension between the two wands is held at a single, sustained intensity that would normally be resolved by one side simply ending. When these two conditions are met, shared core, origin, sustained connection, something occurs that is not a spell. It is not the result of either wizard's intention. It is the wands themselves, or the magic within them, responding to a situation that their nature created. A golden thread of force becomes visible between the wands. A dome of light forms where the beams meet, and from within that dome, if the connection holds, the echoes of the last spells performed by one or both wands emerge like ghosts, not copies, not recreations, but something closer to memories, made briefly visible. This is the element that Ollivander described as among the most mystifying in all of wand lore. Not the phenomenon itself. That much could be, if not fully explained, at least observed and documented with some consistency. But the memories, the echoes, the fact that a wand appears, when placed in this specific situation, to carry some record of what has passed through it. Not merely a physical record in the way that would carries the marks of what it has been through. A magical record. Something accessible, under the right conditions, to anyone present at the event. Ollivander was too careful a scientist to say more than he knew. He did not claim to understand the mechanism. He documented the conditions under which the phenomenon occurred. He noted its consistency, that brother wands in sustained connection reliably produced this effect. Not occasionally, not sometimes, but with the kind of regularity that indicated a principle rather than a fluke. And he concluded, with the honesty of a man who had spent his life trying to understand one law, and knew exactly where the limits of that understanding lay, that he found it mystifying. In the cemetery of Little Hangleton, between Harry Potter and Lord Voldemort, priori incontempore occurred in conditions that even those present imperfectly understood at the time. The shared core, two feathers from the same phoenix, the phoenix called Fawkes, kept by Albus Dumbledore, who had understood their significance when he gave one feather to each wand, and who had, perhaps, suspected, without being certain, that this moment would come, connected to wands that had been fashioned to serve diametrically opposed purposes, one to protect, one to destroy. And when they met, the magic between them did not choose sides. It simply expressed itself. The echoes that emerged from Voldemort's wand were the most recent of its victims, the shades of the last people it had killed, manifesting in reverse order of death. Among them, figures that Harry Potter recognized, presences that were more than mere echoes, that spoke, that offered comfort and instruction. This is beyond what theory accounts for. This is one law reaching the edge of itself and acknowledging that the edge exists. Part 9. The Living Wand. What quasi-sentient actually means. We have used the word quasi-sentient several times now, and it deserves examination rather than mere repetition. It is the kind of word that sounds scientific, that sounds like it belongs in a textbook, and therefore requires no further interrogation, when in fact it is, if anything, more mysterious for having a name. A quasi-sentient wand is not sentient in the way a human is sentient. It does not have a continuous inner life. It does not experience boredom when not in use, pleasure when performing well, grief when damaged. It does not have desires in any anthropomorphic sense. If it has preferences, and it demonstrably does, those preferences are not arrived at through deliberation. They do not change on reflection. They are simply present, the way a magnet's preference for iron is present, not chosen, not reasoned, but real. What quasi-sentient captures is something specific, the wand's capacity to respond to conditions in ways that were not programmed into it by its maker, and cannot be entirely explained by physics or known magical theory. The way a wand will underperform for a wizard using it for purposes that conflict with its wood's character, as though it is registering an objection. The way a wand will perform extraordinary magic in the moment of its owner's genuine need, exceeding what the wizard's skill alone would account for. The way allegiance shifts, not mechanically, not on a predetermined schedule, but in response to events in a manner that suggests something within the wand is tracking those events and drawing conclusions. A wand of blackthorn, for instance, a wood associated with struggle, with the kind of magic that is forged in difficulty, performs notably better for its owner after they have endured significant hardship than it does at the beginning of their relationship. This is not because the wizard has practiced. Practice alone does not account for the magnitude of the difference. The wand appears, in some sense, to develop alongside the wizard through the experience of difficulty, as though the struggle that is the blackthorn's essential nature is recognized in its owner's journey and responds with increased commitment. This cannot be fully explained by any existing theory of magical mechanics. It is not a property of the wood alone, not a property of the core alone, not a product of the wizard's magical development alone, though all three contribute to it. It is an emergent property, something that arises from the relationship between wand and wizard, from the accumulated history of their interaction, in a way that cannot be fully predicted from examining either component in isolation. These behaviors imply something that acts like awareness without being awareness as we recognize it, something that responds to meaning rather than merely force. A wand is not simply a conductor for the wizard's magic. It is a participant. It brings something of its own, and that something is not entirely subject to control. Ollivander understood this better than perhaps any wand-maker before him, and it is why his approach, his insistence on the supreme core, on equality, would properly matched, on the craft of pairing, was not merely about producing reliable results. It was about creating a tool that was worthy of the relationship, a wand that could participate in magic without undermining it, that could bring its own character to the partnership without overwhelming the wizard's will. He was not merely a craftsman. He was, in the deepest sense, a matchmaker between human beings and objects that were more than objects, between witches and wizards and instruments that would become, over time, genuinely part of them. The shop in Diagon Alley, the stacked boxes, the narrow aisles, the old man with the pale eyes who looked at you as though he were reading something written in a language most people didn't know existed, was the physical expression of this philosophy. Every wand in those boxes had been made with a specific character in mind, not a specific owner. Ollivander could not predict who would come through the door, but a specific character, a specific magical personality, waiting for the person whose own character would answer it. The choosing that occurs in that shop is not theater. It is not the performance of a tradition maintained out of sentiment. It is the functional expression of a truth about wandcraft that 2,000 years of practice and study have consistently confirmed. The right wand in the right hand is something categorically different from the wrong wand in any hand. The difference is not a matter of degrees. It is a matter of kind. Part 10. The Legacy. What 2,000 years has wrought. Stand in Diagon Alley and look at that narrow shop front, peeling gold letters, dusty windows, the accumulated grime of centuries of magical London settling on glass through which, if you lean close enough, you can just make out the shapes of boxes stacked in towers, each one containing a wand that has not yet met the person it is waiting for. This is not merely a shop. It is the culmination of 2,000 years of accumulated knowledge about the single most important tool in the wizarding world. Every wand in those boxes reflects a decision about wood, about core, about length and flexibility and the angle of the taper that draws on a tradition. Stretching from the fog-wrapped druidic forests of pre-Roman Britain to the systematic genius of Garrick Ollivander in his quiet workshop. Consider what that lineage represents. The Druids who first articulated the magical character of wood, who expanded the definition of tree to encompass everything with a woody stem, who mapped the personalities of oak and ash, and yew and elder, with a precision that later traditions confirmed. rather than superseded. The Ollivanders who arrived from the Mediterranean with the concept of wandcraft as a transmissible, improvable craft rather than a sacred and static ritual. The generations of wandmakers who followed, each contributing to the growing body of knowledge about which woods paired with which cores, to produce which kinds of magic for which kinds of people. The world changed dramatically in the years after Ollivander's defining revolution. The introduction of the Supreme Core standardized wand-making in ways that had profound downstream effects on magical practice. Wands became more reliable, which made spellcasting more reliable, which made the teaching of magic more reliable, which eventually made institutions like Hogwarts more viable than they might have been in an era when a young witch could not be certain that her wand would respond consistently from day to day. The level of magical precision available to modern practitioners, the ability to perform spells with the kind of reproducible accuracy that transforms dueling from a bloody lottery into something approaching a discipline, that allows healers to reliably replicate successful treatments, that permits the kind of large-scale enchantment work that has shaped magical infrastructure across Britain, depends on wands that work, that respond, that choose their owners thoughtfully. This was not always available. It was not inevitable. It required generations of work, culminating in one wand-maker's determination to hold himself and his craft to a standard of excellence that brooked no compromise. But what is remarkable about the tradition is what remained constant even as everything else evolved. The Druidic understanding of wood, the knowledge that the living tree is not merely a source of timber, but a repository of magical character, that the species matters, the individual tree matters, the season of harvest and the nature of the harvest matter. This knowledge was never lost. It was refined, systematized, expanded enormously, but at its center it retains the shape of the original insight. Wood is alive with meaning, and the wand-maker's first obligation is to understand that meaning deeply. The relationship between wand and wizard that the Druids intuited, that a wand is not simply picked up and wielded, but chosen and known, is still the center of every legitimate wand-making tradition in Britain, and indeed throughout most of the magical world. Ollivander's shop exists because that relationship is real, because the choosing matters, because giving a young witch or wizard a wand that does not suit them is not merely suboptimal, but actively wrong. There are 11 magical subjects taught at Hogwarts. Every one of them requires a wand. Every one of them depends on the relationship between student and instrument being as close to right as the art of wand-making can make it. The potions I taught, and yes, a wand matters even in potions, more than students typically appreciate in the subtle, non-verbal magic that an experienced potioneer applies, depended on wands that worked, on instruments that were worthy of the task. Every spell ever performed in the history of the wizarding world was performed through a wand, or, in the absence of a wand, as a reminder of everything a wand provides. The history of magic is inseparable from the history of its primary instrument. To understand one is to understand the other. The name Ollivander has survived 2,000 years and is known to every magical child in Britain before they have performed a single intentional spell. This is because the family that bears the name earned that recognition, not through self-promotion, not through the kind of commercial aggression that displaces substance with spectacle, but through the slow, accumulating weight of being right, of being consistently, reliably, verifiably right about the thing that matters most, the right wand, for the right person, made with the right understanding of what a wand actually is, and what a wand actually is, when you have followed the full arc of its history, from the crude druidic stems snapped from hedgerows to the precisely paired instruments in their tissue-lined boxes, is this: a relationship waiting to happen, a character waiting for a compliment, a half-finished thing that only becomes what it was made to be in the moment of connection with the person it was always, in some sense, for. Epilogue. What the wand knows. There is a thing that wand-makers will sometimes say, or will sometimes have said to them by the wand, when they hold it, after making a feeling, a sense of having created something that is not quite finished, that the final stage of the making occurs not in the workshop, but in the shop, not when the wand-maker sets it down, but when someone else picks it up. A wand that has never been chosen is a wand in a state of waiting, complete as an object, but not yet complete as a wand. The last element of what it is has not yet materialized, because the last element of what it is depends on who it is for. The wood has its character, the core has its nature, the craftsmanship has its quality. But the full expression of all of this, the realized potential, rather than the potential, merely waits for the person who walks through the door. Who will you be to your wand? What will it know of you that you have not yet articulated to anyone, perhaps not even to yourself? What quality does it recognize in you that made it flex and lift, and send a warmth up your arm and through your chest, choosing you among everyone else who might have held it that day? The wand chooses the wizard. We have said this, we have explained the mechanisms, we have traced the 2,000 years of knowledge and craft and accumulated understanding that made the choosing possible in the way that it now occurs. But there is still something in it, even after all the explanation has been applied, that resists being fully accounted for. Some remainder that persists after the science, some recognition between two things, one of wood and ancient living mystery, one of flesh and magic, and accumulated human experience, that is genuine. This is why the history of wands is not merely a technical history. It is not a record of improving instrument quality, though it is that too. It is a record of the deepening relationship between magical human beings and the instruments that allow them to be most fully what they are. 2,000 years have not resolved the mystery of it. They have only made the mystery more beautiful, more intricate, more worth understanding. The boxes in Ollivander's shop are waiting, as they always have been, as perhaps they always will be. Now let your eyes close. There is nothing more to see here that the darkness will not show you better than the light. Think of wood, think of forest. Think of the particular quiet at the center of a tree that has stood for centuries and absorbed the world's magic into itself slowly, patiently, the way trees absorb everything without urgency, without drama, with the absolute confidence of something that has nowhere it needs to be and nothing it needs to prove. That is where your wand came from. And that is where, if you are still enough, if you are quiet enough, you can feel it still. Sweet dreams. The wand remembers,